Good evening, and welcome to this event on the future of workspaces. I am grateful to Alan Saeg, Nashid Nabian, Panos, all the members of the Responsive Environments Group here at the GST for arranging this event. Just briefly, I think for everyone who's familiar with the domain of architecture, I think everyone knows that the word function has a very long and very specific history in terms of the evolution and sort of the development of modernism. And it came really at one point to mean something very specifically rational. It became very critical in terms of the way in which, for example, through the articulation of such concepts as minimum existence, the interior of buildings became subjected to very specific questions of rules and regulations, dimensions, and so on. I remember, as someone who studied in the 70s, which is a long time ago, that, for example, the concept of the width of a house as an element of how you've worked out the design or study of a house was very critical. So we were given, for example, the dimension of 3.60 meters, which is about 12 feet, to 5.40 meters as the potential range of width to try and figure out what would be the various typological options that could fit within that 3.60 meters to 5.40 meters, because with 3.60 meters you could just literally get a door in that would be 70 centimeters, and then your 2.90 meters gave you the rest of the width of your room and the house. So actually there was something very specific about the notion of functionality, which is also really linked to concepts such as Taylorism and so on. Over the years, I think in the context of schools like the GSD, we've come to sometimes not use the word function in that same sense. We use the word function in other ways, but we are using words like use probably more often. And in the context of the GSD, the manner in which we understand the uses of various typologies, various types of buildings, but also specifically the interior of buildings. Really, what is the relationship between use, functionality, and performance? All of those words, all of those subjects have become really important themes and important issues. Obviously, in the more recent past, and specifically related to the role of the Responsive Environments Group, the concept of technology and the interaction with technological procedures and processes adds another dimension to the use and the role of the interior, as well as what we have been very much interested in, and I'm very happy that some of our friends and colleagues from Knoll are here, that this issue of furniture and the way in which actually the equipment of the interior becomes part of the way in which we inhabit and we use interiors suddenly brings into conversation not only the realm of architecture, the realm of interiors, the concept of use, the way in which the functionality of various spaces are now also really part and parcel of this broader apparatus. So it's important for us to remember that there is a relationship in a way between the conversations we're having today and the talk that was given by Konstantin Gercic 2 nights ago in terms of some of his work, and I'm sure in some ways to the talk that we'll have tomorrow from Thomas Heatherwick, who is here from London and will be speaking tomorrow afternoon. So I'm really delighted that these themes are becoming part of the same group of themes and subjects, and look forward to all the wonderful presentations. So please welcome Alan Sayek, who's going to introduce tonight and the speakers.
Thank you, Mohsen. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alan Sayek. I'm an adjunct associate professor here at the GSD, and I'm the principal of Invivia. I had the Responsive Environments and Artifacts Lab, REAL, which tonight's event is organized by, also with Panayotis Mikalatos and Nashid Nabian, who will join the discussion later. I'm going to start by telling you about something that happened a few months ago. I was running late to a meeting at my office here in Cambridge. Driving from Boston to Cambridge, I went on Google Hangout on my iPhone, and I placed the iPhone on my dashboard. I had a video conference with two of my colleagues in 2 different time zones while driving. Probably not the safest way to drive, and I'm sure it's going to be illegal soon. But it was an extremely productive meeting. It reminded me of a famous quote by Gibson: "The future has already arrived. It's just not evenly distributed yet." Now, the curious thing, the meeting that we had on Google Hangout was to discuss the furniture, the finishes, and the textures of a new meeting and conference room that we are remodeling. Tonight's symposium is titled "The Future of Workspace." What does the future of workspace mean? What does the future of anything mean in a design school? After all, we design things that to exist in the future. Everything we do in a design school is about the future. We design buildings and structures that need to last 20, 30 years, even longer. In a sense, talking about the future in a design school almost feels a bit redundant. Well, somehow this future feels a bit more unpredictable than the other futures of the past. To give you an example, let's take a short look back. 3 days ago, Google announced Google Knows, a database of 15 million cents just a click away. Albeit this was just an April Fool's joke, it felt almost plausible. 10 years ago, what we think of social media and Facebook did not exist. 20 years ago, for those of you old enough in the audience to remember, the internet was a very new creature explored by a select few who were the uncool, nerdy geeks. So why do we want to talk about the future of workspace? Not just simply because the future is already here and we can be in multiple places at the same time or smell the roses at a distance, but because very little has changed in how we think of what a workspace is. Our mental construct of a workspace full of productivity tools on physical tables hasn't changed much since the days of typewriters, then PCs on every table and desk. We know and feel that it is an extremely important thing to have a physical meeting room, and we are comfortable being in the safe lab of the 20th century mechanical thinking when it comes to how we work and what we produce. But when you think of a productivity tool such as the iPhone in the car as a workspace, the whole notion of form and function disappears on a product and productivity level. Also on spatial level, which has massive and very complex repercussions on the built environment. Some extreme technophiles might call this longing of a physical space a pure nostalgia, but we know the more digital we go, the more physical we need to become, and vice versa. But we still don't quite have the right tools and vocabulary to think about what hybrid digital-physical state we are in. Yes, we are in the business of designing places and buildings that should last a long time, and we have strategies to think about the future scenarios based on what history had taught us. When it comes to ever-growing digitally driven, digitally augmented, digitally connected, and digitally complemented environments, such as new ways of learning spaces in schools and museums, workspaces in offices and office buildings, health spaces in hospitals, and dare I say, every type of space that we inhabit, the technologically induced social change is happening much faster than the physical environment can catch up with. So when it comes to designing the built environment, very soon we will have 2 choices, and allow me to be a bit extreme here. One, we can design hollow architectural skins that play it safe for people to occupy them as they wish in the future. 2, commit to a specific program that suggests a form with the risk of it being obsolete by the time the construction is complete. Both of these choices don't look very compelling, hence the reason we need to think and discuss this crazy but exciting future. I don't know how we were able to arrange this, but we have a powerhouse panel today. I mean, each one of these speakers would have been fantastic to have by themselves, but we have 6 of them. I think we got a bit greedy. We wanted to have all of them together. Basically, each panelist will have a short discussion, a short presentation, and we will convene at the table for a discussion afterwards. I will do a short presentation of their background, and you can read their full bios in the handouts that are provided to you. The first 2 speakers, I think they're speaking together, will be both from Knoll. Andrew Cogan. Andrew B. Cogan has served as a director since February 1996 and assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer of Knoll, Inc. In April 2001, after serving as Chief Operating Officer since December 1999, Mr. Cogan has held several positions in the design and marketing group worldwide since joining Knoll in 1989, including Executive Vice President, Marketing and Product Development, and Senior Vice President. Mr. Cogan is also Director of Kinati Foundation, Marfa, Texas, sorry. Yeah, I need a glass of wine, I think. And Andrew will talk with Benjamin Pardo. And Benjamin A. Pardo was appointed as Knoll's Executive Vice President Director of Design in July 2011. Prior, he served as Senior Vice President Director of Design in September 2005. Mr. Pardo was President of Unifor, Inc., and he had been employed there since 1988. I welcome both speakers.
Good evening, everybody. Dean Mustafazi, thank you for having us here, and Alan, thank you for putting this. We enjoyed when we visited with you a couple weeks ago and a couple months ago and talked about what's going on. I really think this conference is very apropos because I think this is probably one of the most exciting times in terms of the reimagination of the workplace that we've seen go on in at least 2 or 3 generations. It's the confluence of changes in technology, of culture, and economic pressures, which really are challenging companies to very fundamentally rethink what the workplace is and can be. When we look at it, Knoll, and I want to thank my colleague Alana Stevens, who's here tonight, who's really led some of our next work research, which this very much reflects and everything, we see really 4 or 5 major drivers of change. The first clearly is a demographic shift. And I think one of the challenges we see in the workplace is you have this confluence in the workplace of many different generations right now who are used to radically different ways of working. Some are used to the primacy of the cubicle. Others are used to much more collaborative environments in everything they do. People who are used to very different work styles and very different ways of connecting and interacting. And the workplace is being challenged to support all those environments. There's a ubiquity of technology that's really eroding the boundary between work and home, or time you're on or time you're off. So those factors are playing a part. There's great demand for speed and innovation and a belief that if you create the right environment, right or wrong, it's going to foster innovation and collaboration. Certainly that's the mantra a lot of companies are clinging to. I think innovation is probably a lot deeper than just your physical space. But clearly that's something people are looking at. And then we see this every day, a relentless drive for cost containment. How can you do more with less? How can you reduce the amount of interior space that you're using by 20 or 25% and lower your costs and improve the profitability of your enterprise? Those are very much real issues we see people working with today. What that's really done is, I think, blown up the primacy of the cubicle, which really was the planning model, certainly for the 80s and 90s, and really challenged the idea of what a individual's workspace should be and whether there should even be an individual's workspace. You know, historically, the idea was you came to an office and you had your space. And this really, you started with your own office, then it devolved into the workstation. And now the whole idea and question of should there even be an individual place in a workplace is something companies are fundamentally relooking. We're seeing kind of what we call distributed work and a much more collaborative environment where work is taking place a lot less often at your individual desk and a lot more at these kind of interstitial spaces and collaborative areas, and a fundamental rebalancing of how much space is dedicated to the individual and how much is dedicated to the group. Not everyone is happy with this. You know, going back to my point on the generations, some people feel that, you know, where did my cube go? That was the place I worked. That's now gone. I come to the office. I have no place to go. Others are thrilled with that and are thrilled to have this group environment they can work in. So again, this real push and pull between the individual and the group, and the tension of where are you most productive and where do you get your work done. You know, if you had this conference 10 years ago, I guarantee you someone would have said the workplace was obsolete, that people are not going to work in offices anymore. I think the funny thing that we've seen is that exactly the opposite is true. You look at the chart on the left looks at the percentage of people that work in the office, and this was a survey that we just completed this year. Shockingly, over 80 to 85% of the people do the bulk of their work in the office 5 days a week. You can see totally remote, which I think is what everyone envisioned in terms of telecommuting, in terms of how all this technology would free us up, like Alan was saying, to work out of your car on, you know, on an iPhone. Is a very, very small fraction. As we've seen at times of crisis or disaster where people can't physically get into their workplace, the productivity and effectiveness really drops. So the importance of place, I think, has been really reaffirmed. What companies are struggling with then is, okay, we need that place. What's the balance and what should that place be doing? What's the balance between the individual, between the group? And individuals in that environment are trying to figure out how do they create an environment where they can focus on the work they have at hand and not be distracted by everything going else around them. It's kind of the ADD challenge in terms of the entire workplace. How do you carve out in this much more open environment a space for you to focus and really do your best? And my favorite is that 30% of people decide just leave the building is the best place to do it. So clearly we're not meeting those opportunities. There is a renewed interest in harnessing creativity and capturing innovation. I think really the role of the workplace to attract and retain talent, to be a laboratory, to bring kind of the startup vitality that kind of now has become the new iconic work environment, to create an atmosphere where the technology, when you think about your house and TVs you have and that ubiquitous access to technology. You know, it used to be you had a computer at work, you didn't have one at home. Now you have one everywhere. The technology you're using both domestically and in your work life have all merged together. And so that's the demand that people are thinking when they think about an office environment. They're thinking about a workspace that gives them access to that wherever they are. It's really, I think, the glamorization of work is what we're seeing going on. And in a funny way, that works at a certain, you know, elite level. Not everyone finds work glamorous. Not everyone's doing glamorous, you know, intellectually challenging creative work. But nonetheless, that's kind of become the iconic image that people are pursuing in everything. And the workplace, you can't open a magazine, you can't open a newspaper, you can't read something online without people talking about work. I don't care whether it's Mad Men in the 1950s and 60s or the front page of the Wall Street Journal yesterday was a whole article on changing work culture. This is a topic that is first and foremost on people's minds today and everything. One of the things, that, if you've all seen the Marissa Mayer quote, where she basically, one of the first things she did coming into Yahoo was eliminate the idea of telecommuting. It really gets back to the idea that, you know what, even with all these technologies, it is back to the office. The collaborative, the social value of we're social beings, of getting people together and creating an environment where people can come together is clearly something that's not going to ever be supplanted virtually. So we think the challenges as people look at this, there are a couple key criteria that workplaces are being asked to meet. First, you know, encourage presence through an environment that's engaging and that pulls people in. Offer a variety of horizons, both in terms of levels of privacy and openness, types of spaces, and both formal and informal meeting areas that foster those kind of opportunities to get together. Rethink the amount of space you're dedicating to the individual and the group. If you went back, we do a lot of work with eBay as an example. If you went back about 5 or 6 years ago, they were doing about 80 to 85% of their spaces were focused on the individual and about 15 to 20 on the group. Today, as they're designing new facilities, it's about 50-50. And it's entirely possible that mix will continue to evolve over time. Allow the users to shape the environment. That's certainly something we're seeing a lot more requests for user control, in bringing those groups together, creating environments, and then breaking them down. And design with a level of impermanence. This is not going to last forever. We're seeing planning responding to the trends I talked about by shifting the balance between shared, group, and individual spaces. It used to be, again, you'd see a lot more on the dedicated, on the orange, and a lot less on the blue. The other big thing we're seeing as a design trend is where those places are put. Don't put the conference and the group and the meeting areas off in the corner. Put them in these interstitial spaces where people are passaging through, where they're traveling through, and where those are really kind of at nexus of the environment interaction. Because if those places are put at the perimeter, they're not used. If they're put in the center, they're used and grouped. And we think this offers a phenomenal design opportunity. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Benjamin Pardo to talk about a project and a collaboration on really work tools that we've been doing for the last year and a half with Rem Koolhaas and the group from OMA. It's really a phenomenal project that's really provocative in terms of thinking about how do you move from static to dynamic furniture elements? How do you rethink what the individual does in the context of the group? And how do you offer those individuals kind of a sense of architectural control in terms of shaping their space and adjusting to the kind of kinesthesis that we see going on in today's environment? Benjamin?
Of everything that Andrew just said, why did we talk to Rem Koolhaas? So recently I was asked that question. I'm going to read you my response, and then I'm very quickly going to take you through a series of images that talk to you about what it is that we've done. So the question was, why did Noel want to work with OMA? And I said the following. Because of the way Rem Koolhaas thinks about architecture, in general, I'm drawn to his thinking, not always exactly to what it is that he's saying, but to the frankness with which he says it and his ability to dismiss extraneous stuff. And we wanted to see a contemporary figure interpret modernist ideas. Some of the pieces are, in their static state, very much like Florence Knoll pieces. They are the background pieces that create sub-architecture in an architectural space. Yet there's a kinesthetic quality to the collection. Many of the pieces adjust, move, or transform. Certain pieces undergo a metamorphosis. It is the first time since Frank Gehry's collection where we've done something that says, here's an architect of today who is challenging us to think about furniture and ideas related to both business and domestic environments. And it's not just about wonderful objects, but rather about how people interact with space and architecture. It's a collection of products that really pushes how it is that we're working, thinking, and living. What it does is really mean to be able to sit on the floor with people and have a meeting, and then an hour later use that same table at a full standing height for something entirely different. So what I want to start with is a series of images that are pretty clear. These are my models that Andrew and I sat with Rem in Paris, and we showed him these models. And what was very important to me in terms of talking him through all of this was to provide a level of neutrality, not to have any kind of indication as to what the object could be, should be, materiality sense, any kind of design sense whatsoever. It's clear, Lucite product. And what we're talking about, if you look at those slides, you have an understanding that it's really all about relationship of height. This is the first step that we talked about. So in that first quote, what I said is that it's that ubiquitous opportunity to work with technology, whether you're sitting on the floor or you're standing. And it's really about adjustment of the horizon line and the kinesthesis associated with the horizontal surface. So that's the first aspect that I want to talk about. This is the team. So clearly we got Rem on the team. We got Rem and a young Italian guy who's the head of his product department. There he is again. This is myself sitting in a chair. This is Andrew reviewing some stuff. The guy with the beard is one of the senior guys at the OMA office, and there's one of our engineers there. That's Ippolito. This is a woman from the Interiors Department. She's employee number 7 at OMA. And this is the head of our engineering department. And one of our engineers. So I think what's really important is that you're putting together a corporate environment, you're putting together an architect, you're putting together engineers, and you're putting together a series of industrial practices to physically make some really complicated stuff. So we started here. We basically started with these very simple block forms, and the first expressions were very much about materiality. And we were talking about what could the objects be. So we talked first about height, but now it really starts to talk about how are we physically going to divide spaces. So you start to see some of these forms that are quite vertical, and we start to talk about the counter. And we also talk about seating at various heights. Again, maintaining all, you start to see in his models, there's a very strong parallel to the models in simplicity and materiality and transparency to the original presentation that was given to him. We worked in this capacity. There was an enormous amount of dialogue in terms of working through models. These models then had the opportunity to become environments. So we really understood the relationships between the various pieces one to the other and how they had relationships to planning in an office building itself with adjacencies to workstations. So we worked through these things through the model-based process. This was a big meeting in Amsterdam or in Rotterdam. And this is basically you roll up your sleeves and you figure it out. This meeting was an incredible aha moment because it had to do with this object. This is the beginning of the counter. And the counter started out as a series of 3 material blocks. It was monolithic in form, and it was static. It was the seating and the tables that moved. So here it is static with figure, until one day it shifted. It wasn't right. So we sat there and said that why can't we give the same level of kinesthesis and cantilever to this particular object? Here it is in its first industrialized state with an interior mechanism. In our first review, you start to understand the idea of cantilever. Understand that this can bear the weight of 730 pounds at full extension and cantilever on the top portion. So there's quite an incredible engineering feat going on here as well. This is a review with Andrew. There's the cake. We all had lunch on this thing. And there's an opportunity to stand, sit, and also sit on the floor associated with this. So it becomes the centralized piazza. It is a point of congregation for people to come together. It starts to talk, now we're going through the industrialization of the product. We're seeing it getting ready for the introduction of it at the Salone starting next Tuesday with an introductory party on Monday at the Prada space. Gearing, you're starting to see the first finished pieces. You're starting to see the first level of articulation. They'll be done on big, large plates because of the weight required, but they can be attached to the floor standardly. In full cantilever. So let's start to talk about the chair, this simple little Corbu chair that's encapsulated in clear material. So here we are starting to talk about our first model to a cardboard full-scale model shoved out in the corner where there was actually daylight so we could see the damn thing. To the original conversations with Rem about how high and low. The chair has a couple of different versions, and it talks about the concept of enclosure and then also being low, and there's also one that's quite transformational. He was very much involved in this process. Again, first review with Andrew. Then this was a very fun review, starting to talk about some of the available textiles that are there. And then we're at a point now where we're moving forward with a chair that is foam and is quite high and wraps so that you can pull it up and down and be completely private or extend out. So again, the chair is not only adjustable in its overall height, but it also has the capability to be completely enveloping, but also give you an opportunity to fold it down and then look through and overall and understand space. The table. This table has a throw. It goes down to be on the floor at 20 inches and then goes all the way up to 46 inches. So this is an incredible mechanism. You have an enormous amount of throw, and it's all done on a single column. First models of the table, and then the first view of the table. The table has a glass top. We were experimenting. We're doing a very low Japanese-like chair. We had to figure out how high it needed to be. This is it's completely transparent. There's two pieces of glass. It's an incredible structure, and it's actually quite solid. There you're seeing one of the first mechanisms. It's now moved to being pneumatic rather than mechanical. You're seeing the difficulty that the mechanical was giving us in order to make it go up and down. Not everything always works the first time. And then this is the review of all the guys with the hats. It's like the bald men. In the freezing cold factory, there was 14 inches of snow in Milan, and it was quite cold on the interior that day. We were all hugging onto our cup of coffee. And the overall review. So you can see that the process itself is not only that of the review of the object, but there's a really direct involvement on a manufacturing level back to the people making this stuff and interaction with the engineers. So the idea is momentary, but it's the execution that takes months and months, right? Fully extended with the overall team. Now we're talking about a very low table, and this table can be used with the chair or you can be seated. And the table extends outward, so it has a very similar form to that of the counter. It started out with this wonderful heart shape when you looked at it completely stacked in a rectangle and in terms of its overall form before it extended outward. And you can see Rem looking down into that heart shape. And this was approved. There's that actual drawing as we started to make modifications to that form. But unfortunately, the heart got screwed because it didn't work. And we started to move more to a form that was this overall oblong. There's a real appreciation and understanding of the mechanical aspect of this. It is a completely clear table. And this you're starting to see the internal portion to start to get these things to move. But when it does this and you're seated at it, there's really an opportunity to take the table towards you and to use it in the area that's most appropriate for you in that overall space, whether it's a cup of coffee or reading material or exchange of information. The mech, we had colored red. Anything that has to do with motion in the system is red. And then I'm ending here with, I think it's one or two slides. I think let's start here, is that this starts to be the manifestation of Andrew Kogan's office in our new space at 1336th Avenue, and some of the models that we put together for him for the presentation of the product that we were using. And here's another series of models that was put together. So the real question here is one of how do these pieces of furniture have an attachment back to what it is that Andrew was talking about? And what they need to do is give people the opportunity to come together, share information, and work or live. Because I think that, quite frankly, what is the difference between standing in your kitchen and having a conversation with your guests or your kids or your spouse, and exchanging information with your coworkers and developing an idea? The environments can be quite similar, and the counter can perform those things, as can the low table. So the introduction of technology is one that these things are all quite friendly to. So this is the work that we've done with REM. These pieces will be shown for the first time, as I said, starting on Monday in Milan. It's been an incredible experience. You've seen 4 of 11 objects that are being introduced in the line, and I hope that you have an opportunity to experience them and see them. And I have a big red 0, so I'm finished.
Our next speaker is Antoine Picon. Antoine doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to do a quick introduction, a very short one. You can read his extended bio in the handout. Antoine Picon is the G. Ware Travelstead Professor of History of Architecture and Technology and co-director of doctoral programs, PhD and D-Days at the GST. He's trained as an engineer, architect, and a historian. Picon works on the history of architectural and urban technologies from the 18th century to the present. Picon's most recent book, Digital Culture in Architecture: An Introduction to the Design Profession, offers a comprehensive overview and discussion of the changes brought by the computer to the theory and practice of architecture. Antoine.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, I'll begin probably as an historian. When one tries to evaluate what is really happening during periods of rapid technological and social transition, the great difficulty is usually to avoid two pitfalls. The first trap is to believe in simplistic scenarios in which everything is going to change once and for good in a totally dramatic manner. The other symmetric bias is, of course, to believe that nothing is going to change. Retrospectively, if we look at past episodes, things did change indeed a number of times, but not always, and this will be where I'd like to start, as expected. Another difficulty when one tries to understand what's going on and what's the future of workspace lies in the implicit systems of value that we adopt while trying to assess the situation. These values often color our analysis in a way that resemble prejudice. So I'd like to take a couple of examples from the past. Since the dawn of the first industrial revolution, the relation between working at home and working in dedicated collective spaces has been a constant subject of inquiry. It has led repeatedly to hopes of seeing the general movement towards working in specialized places stopped or even reversed. And let me remind you that in the early modern period, lots of people worked at home, actually, artisans, etc. So a good example is toward the end of the 19th century, when electricity arrives, the debate around what is called at the time small engines. With the development of electricity, actually, people began to believe that, miniaturization was possible, and so that you could be an industrial worker at home, back at home. So a lot of people dreamt about that, and around the same period, actually, you had also the first dream of education at home. This is a caricature by the French caricaturist Robida, and this is a woman learning from home. So, actually, this is not what happened. A telling story, by the way, around this period of time is what happened to the engineer Diesel, a German engineer, who believed that he was developing a small engine and ended up with an engine that powered ships and trucks. With electricity, what happened was actually a new concentration of work with a massive development of administration, both in the public and private sector. Now, if we look at the systems of values, the story of the relation between the home and the workplace becomes even more complicated. There were always, pretty much to simplify, two conflicted sets of observation and ideological agendas. The first consisted actually in finding the workplace emancipatory, despite its shortcomings like harsh discipline. This was, for example, something that the French social reformer Michel Chevalier in the 1840s was struck by when he visited Lowell in Massachusetts and noted that the industrial production enabled young women to emancipate themselves from the tutelage of the male member of their families, father and brothers. And actually, this is a journal that was published of the writing of the women worker in Lowell, and something quite new at the time. And actually, recent history of the first industrial revolution has really very much insisted on the role it played in freeing women. So the other set of observation and ideological agenda has taken the reverse view, that of a radical alienation produced by the separation between home and workplace. So the reason why I'm mentioning these past episodes is that we may have sometimes the impression that there is a kind of replay of these kind of debates today. First, the debate on the workplace is dominated again by the question of working elsewhere than in the classical workplace. Home appears again as a possible location for teleworking, distance working. And in that respect, one may wonder whether the computer is not the inheritor of late 19th century allegedly small engines, the small engine of the future. We are again confronted to a conflicting set of values. On the one hand, teleworking is often seen as a chance of emancipation. On the other, it is also interpreted as, in a reverse way, as an enhanced form of alienation. And you have a lot of trade unions who denounce actually, teleworking, working from distance, because actually, it's cheaper in terms of office space. So and think also of all the critiques of, the abolition of the distinction between work and private life, with the smartphone debates, for example, etc. So where are we, and what can we try to say? Historians are usually poor prophets, sorry for you, but being in a design school, let me take some risk. First, it's pretty clear that digital tools go in the direction of teleworking. And in France, a recent study has shown that almost 17% of workers are already impacted by it, which is quite a spectacular figure for France, because the French are especially reluctant to transfer to their home their professional life. One of the reasons is that the workplace is a very important place of socialization, common lunch, that kind of thing, and people are not so keen on working at home very often. Another reason is that actually the surfaces of apartment is pretty small in France, which is also a factor that would limit a priori teleworking. But interestingly, the same study reveals that home is not the only viable alternative to the traditional workplace. And it's quite interesting that, 15% of the teleworker use coffee shop or lounge, that you have something like 8% who use telecenters and shared office. So it's a booming practice, and in France it has known a spectacular rise in the past years. So what seems to me pretty clear is that besides the alternative between work and home, a new nomadic condition is on the rise, even if it concerns a still relatively small proportion of workers, something like 16.7 or 17% people. The time frame remains also limited. The same study shows that 2/3 of the people who work at distance work usually between 1 and 2 days a month. And actually, the people working 1 or 2 days a week outside the office represent only 1/3 of the people who work at distance. So it means that it's still a relatively limited set of things. Another interesting fact is the lack of formal frame for this set of practices. It's generally the result of a tacit agreement between employer and worker, not a formal contract. Now, the most interesting features might have to do in the study with the aspiration expressed by workers. They want to work at a distance, but within reasonable time limits. It's not about suppressing the office. It's about complementing it with other spaces. An interesting also aspect in the French study is that employers are actually more scared by working at distance than employees. So that's also something to meditate. So at that stage, a tempting parallel could be what will happen soon with education, which knows very similar tendencies all over the world. You've all heard about the MOOCs, etc. But actually, distance learning has begun already for a number of years. And this is, there again, interestingly also, it's more often endorsed by students than a lot of faculty are still reluctant, something to meditate. So in both cases, and this will be, where I'd like to conclude this set of remarks, a series of problems arise. First, how should one redefine the workspace when it has no longer a monopoly? So, and this raises the question that has already been asked, what can we do, what should we do there that cannot be done elsewhere? If you take teaching, it's a very clear question today. We can do a lot of things on the internet at distance using the MOOCs, etc. So if we gather in a classroom, what are we supposed to do? So one of the answers, and this will echo what has been said before me, is that it revolves around added value in terms of direct physical interaction, socialization, etc. We may also think of the quality of space. It's pretty clear when the workspace has no longer the monopoly, the quality of space must be dramatically enhanced. So something definitely to think about. And for the classroom, I was quite interested by the presentation about furniture. There are a lot of reflection these days about what's the furniture of the classroom of the future, knowing that it's no longer something classical. So a second series of problems revolve around the need to think about the workspace no longer as a fixed and closed container, but as a node in a much more complex network of places. it's not only something that will function in a kind of tension, home versus office. It's something that will function as a network with a lot of differentiated other types of space, coffee shop, telecenters, etc. So we have to think now of, this new node, no longer a container, but a node, and what kind of relation do we establish between these various places? The internet is only part of the answer. Then we have these unpleasant questions, but which are so important in office life, which is hierarchy, and surveillance. I know, I'm almost finished, don't worry. Hierarchy and surveillance. The traditional workplace, the cubicle went usually with a hierarchy of those who weren't in a cubicle. What happens when the workplace is no longer there again, something structured in the traditional way? Another question is, of course, what happens with security? If we think of the obsession, there is a profound contradiction between the quest for the security of data and this dispersed condition of work. So, for me, and I'll conclude on that, probably it's the end of the monopoly. The first industrial revolution really made us think that the workplace was a monolithic, what I call the container. Now we are facing a much more complex thing. And, so far it has been only office work, but we may think also with digital fabrication that also this kind of network kind of structure will also be among the problems for the future. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Edith Ackermann. Edith is an honorary professor of developmental psychology at University Aix-Marseille in France, a visiting scientist at MIT, visiting professor at the University of Siena. Previously, Ackermann was an associate professor at the MIT Media Lab, and before that, as a scientific collaborator at the Centre International d'Epistémologie Génétique, under the direction of Jean Piaget in Geneva. Edith.
Thank you, Alan. So, in addition to the characteristics of the workplace that have already been mentioned, like mobility, globalization, and sometimes they call it glocalization, remote teamwork, also multicultural teams. There seems to be an increasing concern these days, actually a hype, I would like to say, around age-related or generational tensions in the workplace. And one is entitled to wonder, why? What's the big deal? The issue is encapsulated as follows. When you take members of different generations, blend them together, and ask them to work side by side, you've got both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity to engage a diverse group of people who bring their own experience and skills to the organization. And the challenge is to deal with some of the generational traits that distinguish them. There is a person called Jean Meister who is co-author of a book called The Workplace in the Year 2020. That actually projects that especially in emerging markets, we will soon have 5 generations in the workplace at once. And indeed, it is not unusual even these days to find situations where, say, you have a 55-year-old boomer like myself on project teams with 22-year-old millennials reporting to a 45-year-old Gen Xer, they call them Generation X, while the vets, which are the Ys, the older than 68, they are fewer in numbers, but they may retain positions of influence. Research on so-called digital natives and their complex relation with the post-Gutenbergians that we are, I talk for myself, the digital immigrants, as Prensky calls them, have been widely documented, especially in the field of education, and the gap has often been exaggerated, made incommensurable, or romanticized. Alias, the problematization of generational differences is puzzling. We know, and the saying goes, that it takes a village to raise a child, and I would like to say that it's true also as much of learning children than of working adults. And after all, we are born into tribes where generations mix. There is reasons why people actually enjoy to be with people of different ages. It starts with babies who like their grandmothers, siblings that either fight but also like to work with grown-ups and so forth. Now, I see two reasons why, at least in the US, this becomes a question that people obsess about. The first is that in countries like the US, and I don't know enough about Asia, youngsters leave their family circles pretty early, and once they are out, they tend to cluster in age groups. Education clusters us in age group. And extended families themselves are in extinction. The other reason has to do with the fact that age-related differences, and this is the most important one to me, get amplified beyond the usual sort of hormone-driven generational gaps at times of unrest, and especially at times of deep societal and technological mutations. It was the case, when you think of the passage between oral and written tradition, the Gutenberg print revolution, and now the digital revolution. Now, I will not have time to go enough in these categories, but I am just going to caricature. Usually the studies that talk about generational questions in the workplace divide or slice the population into vets, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. So quick portrait, totally quick portrait, is that the vets are the wise, the old wise, the boomers are the fighters, the Gen Xers are the hackers, the first hackers and entrepreneurs, and the millennials are the awesome navigators. The boomers are used to change, but they are fighters. They came of age in the 60s. I am a typical one. In the streets, in the student movements, Vietnam War, civil rights movement, and so forth. They use computer, and sometimes they even teach computer to other people. But they still work on desktops. They like books. They still have watches around, Moleskines. They think that laptop use during in-person meetings is distracting. They are not at ease in video conferencing situation. They are the Sherry Turkles of Together Alone or the Prensky's digital immigrants. The Gen Xers are the first generation of hackers. They are also the first generation that wouldn't sit still in class, that value the importance of motion and movement for comfort and performance. They are flexible, easygoing. They are cool and not hot in the way they argue. They want a voice in how things are done. And many favor smaller, less bureaucratic businesses. The Gen Xers, of course, have to change since the golden days of the tech bubble, but still their agility, autonomy, confidence puts them in high demand. To me, Alan Sayek is a typical Gen Xer. And the way you describe how you work from the car and so on, you are a typical and I am a typical baby boomer. The millennials, to them, that's our students. To them, digital technology are deeply woven into their everyday lives, and being on the grid is a no-brainer for them. They move swiftly between, that's the big change, they move swiftly between digital, virtual, and physical worlds. Maybe they are less hackers or programmers. They browse, they text, we know them. They check their mail, calendars, all on their smartphones. They also like dependable work communities where knowledge is shared, where the pace is fast. In a way, Prensky has a point when he describes the digital natives as these multitaskers and so on. So the question is, which ones of these differences matter for office design? And I would like to just say that the ones that matter have to do with tech use, but also how people think about the impact of tech use in social protocols. And questions of loyalties and boundaries become important. The digital natives, the differences are between multi and monotasking, modes of inquiry. The digital natives are much more used to iterative process. They plan much less because, in a way, they expect the tools that they use to allow them to easily modify what they are doing, whereas the other ones are used in planning. So oftentimes the digital natives, the first version is really not good. But it doesn't matter because you know that other people are going to help you, and you also know that you have the technologies that allow you to actually make it better. Whereas the older ones, they are anxious, they don't want to speak before they think, they don't want to get something else before it has been thought through and so on. And that makes for big differences. They have different ways of also negotiating difference. I call it hot versus cool. My generation is much more akin to arguing, using words and so on, and they are more easygoing. Issues of proxemics, which has to do with positioning and distancing oneself, of rhythm, of pace, tolerance to noise, levels of commitment and loyalties, how solid and how long-lived are the groups that one wants to participate in. Like for the geeks, sometimes they are very quick at creating groups, but they don't have loyalties over time. So the groups form and undo very quickly. You also have issues of locus of control, attribution of failure, inner or outer driven. I don't have time to go into it. Studies by Edward Hall, Gerd Hofstede, and also Bob Weisfitz are very useful to try to capture better what I don't have the time to talk about. This question also of tolerance to uncertainty, innovation and novelty, and also what they expect as types of feedback, delayed versus immediate gratification. The irony, I would like to say, is that today's workers, whether they are young or old, know that they are lifelong learners. They have to be lifelong learners. And today's lifelong learners are increasingly temporary workers. It's kind of an irony. Whether they are qualified or not, everybody just has to keep working and learning in order to keep afloat in a volatile job market. We are also living in a world where kids are growing older younger, and grown-ups stay younger older. 2 minutes. In such a world, mobility and flexibility are key, which in turn calls for a network of well-conceived, well-equipped, resting and gathering places. They can be settings, they can be plugins, they can be places, they can be cars. And the possibility for people to actually move back and forth, it has already been said, between offices, either their own or those of others, but also conference areas and any place, coffee shops, cyber cafes, airports, libraries, parks, benches, where they want and need to be. Now, the point that is important to me is that we are in a situation where each of these nodes in the network that you were talking about has to rethink its own identity, because it has to connect with other nodes. On the other hand, they cannot all become the same. And this is, to me, a big danger, at least in education, where museum begins to look like school, the cafe looks like an office, the home looks like a cafe, which is fine in a way, but I think it's very important to rethink the identity of these places, like the library and so on, with in mind these different types of practices within. I think I am done. The last word is just forget all I just said, because it's more complicated or much simpler. And I just would like to say that beware of generational generalization, but also this obsession of always focusing on what makes people different, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's like, you name it. So it's important to be very thoughtful of these differences. But in a way, people learn to work and live with others who have different work and lifestyles all the time. And generational traits are just one of the variations that make for a diverse workforce. I don't have the time to go into there, but just look at the little piece with the little people. I think it's just important to think of all these possibilities and to offer a way for people with these different needs to choose the ways in which they like to settle in these different places where they have to go through in their journeys through the day, through the week, and through the months. There are many places and occasions where people from different generations come together. I'm thinking especially of places like symphonies where people play music, theater, dancing, many third places. And this can be a good way of trying to understand what kinds of conditions, what kinds of qualities of environment make them, so to speak, oblivious to all these differences. Because there is something that is stronger and more important than all these differences that we constantly talk about. Voilà. Sorry, I was a bit long.
Thank you. Thank you, Edith. Our next speaker is Craig Webb. A practicing architect for 36 years, Craig Webb has spent the last 23 years of his career as a principal designer at Gary Partners. Craig has been a leader on many noteworthy projects. These projects most notably include the Walt Disney Concert Hall, the Richard B. Fisher Performing Arts Center, the J. Pritzker Pavilion, the Museum of Rock and Roll, to name a few. Craig has been instrumental in the design of many museums worldwide, and of course, most recently, he has designed the new Facebook campus. Craig.
So I'm going to talk about Facebook. Frank, Gary, and I are designing a new building for Facebook in Menlo Park. We are very interested in the project mainly because of the way Facebook works and the way their kind of work environment is happening. They currently are housed in the Sun Microsystems building that they took over about a year ago. It's actually 8 buildings that are hooked together into a single campus. They're 3-story buildings. The building doesn't work for them at all because it divides all the people apart. They are expanding at such a rapid rate that they need more space, a lot more space. We're designing a building of another 400,000 square feet for them. They had a new building designed across the road. It was another building just like the old building with a series of 6 or 8 buildings at 3 and 4 stories, and Frank had a meeting with Mark Zuckerberg and asked, well, what kind of a building do you really want? And his reply was, I want the ideal building for engineers, and I want all 2,800 of my engineers in one big room as close to me as possible. And Frank said, okay, let's do that. So we started working with them, and the first part of what we do is a programming phase where we go into their space, talk to them, and try and figure out how they think, how they work, and so on. And what we found was a very strong identity through a kind of culture, and they referred to it as their culture quite frequently. And what we discovered was that the culture really informs what the workplace is like, and that culture allows the organization to expand very rapidly. They're expanding at something like 3 or 4% a month. And by having this really strong culture, it allows people that are coming in to understand what the organization is about and fit into it really easily and move on with that. It also allows them to globalize in that the culture, when they're in about 30 different locations throughout the world, they kind of imprint that culture into the different organizations, and then they kind of get it, and they all start to have this kind of common means of working. The other fascinating thing about Facebook is that they really believe in what they call flat organization. They really fight hierarchy. They want everybody on the same plane. They want all the ideas coming from everybody simultaneously, and they don't want a corporate culture that pushes people down. So they call it flat organization. This is going to be a bit of a kind of speed reading test here. I'm going to go through, we put together a book where we played back Facebook culture to them in order to get their input. And I'm going to go through, this is probably a quarter of what we did with them. I'm going to go through very quickly. The first idea is this non-hierarchical flat organization. We're looking at ideas about how groups of individuals work and move together without any leader. They move around in their building a lot, so we started to talk to them as though they're nomads. I asked one of the head engineers, how long does somebody stay in a particular work position and in a particular working group? And they said a maximum of 3 months, which means that everybody gets up and moves in the building many, many times a year. And they're also mobile during the day. They all have laptops and cell phones, and they move around the building. They do a lot of the work kind of walking and talking. This is their space. They like this kind of big mess, which we really relate to. It's a lot like our studio in Los Angeles. You can see that the whole thing is set up for maximum flexibility. They drop cables out of the ceiling. They push the desks around. There's very little design to it at all. We asked, how do they move so quickly? And we said, well, everybody only has a laptop and 2 boxes of stuff, and so they can get up and move quickly. So we start playing back what that might look like. It's about like camping out. They move around a lot. And then we started to think, what kind of building should they have? They should have a big warehouse where everything is open and free and they can move it at will. Flexibility is hugely important to them. And they like the relationship of indoor-outdoor spaces. So particularly in California, the buildings open up to the outdoors. They're a hacker culture. It's really, really a part of what they do. They want creativity. They want to be kind of outsider culture. They don't want the corporate culture at all, so they fight it, tooth and nail. This is Frank, I think he was one of the original hackers, just in the way he thought about things. The culture gets expressed by graffitiing the walls of the buildings, and these kinds of ideas get kind of expressed all over the place and in very informal ways, and there are chalkboards, and everyone contributes to what the culture is about. And they believe in not perfecting anything, but doing it quickly, getting it out there. They work in groups. It's a very social organization. So the idea that they might telecommute is really antithetical to how they work. They're very social. They work in groups. They call them scrums. They believe in collaboration. They get together and they write code on the fly. They also, and this is something I think came from Steve Jobs, that particularly Mark, but a lot of the management team believe in having one-on-one meetings while they walk around the campus. And so the relationship to nature, the relationship, this kind of providing spaces where people can walk and really kind of free themselves from their desk is important to them. So we started thinking about that. And then the social thinking aspects of this kind of group think, how the culture makes the organization work. They are very highly serviced employees. So they get, all their food is free. They get their laundry done for them. They have bicycle repair on campus. The doctor's there. Everything's there. So, but snacking is a very social activity for them. It brings people together. They have these micro kitchens all over the campus where people can basically come and kind of browse at will. They also browse on technology. All of the hardware is available to them. And in these vending machines, they put your employee card in, and out comes a keyboard or whatever else you want. The other part that we really puzzled about was, and I guess it has to do with brand. And we started talking about, we have produced a lot of very iconic buildings in the past, and we started talking to them about what they wanted their building to look like. And we said, it could be something like that, very flamboyant. This is our building in Berlin, in Pariser Platz, which basically blends in completely to the environment. They came back and said, totally anonymous. They don't want the building to express anything. They want the most functional engineering space. We thought, wow, this is a great challenge for us. This is our office in LA. We're quite anonymous ourselves, so we totally got it. So after digesting a whole lot of culture, then we started into a design process. And we started talking about the granularity of how they work, what are the team sizes, how big, and we started referring to neighborhoods. And we started playing back. We sort of played it as a board game. The biggest groups they have are 300 people. And so this is the workstations for 300 people, the communal space, the conference rooms, and all the support spaces. And all that stuff has to fit into that rectangle that you see on the side there. So we started saying, let's play a game. Is it the idea that you put everything around the perimeter like the Monopoly board and generate a plan like that? Should it be an open space filled with villas, something like that? Is it more of an urban diagram like that where things are really mixed up? They got quite into that. And then do you put all the common space in the middle like Central Park and then everybody surrounds the outside of it? And where we ended up was really kind of a hybrid and a combination of all those things. So this is the final design. We're getting under construction this summer. This building sits on a 20-acre site. The maximum lot coverage is 50%. There's basically a 10-acre building and one floor plan. The parking is underneath. And you can see that's 2,800 workstations. They, of course, immediately asked us, well, how many more can we fit in? Can you give us 3,000? Can you give us 3,500? We said, yeah, you can pack them in as tight as you want. So basically everything contained inside of that wrapper is flexible, movable. And then, of course, the question comes up, well, how do you feel in this 10-acre warehouse with 2,800 people? And so we sort of proposed a kind of interior landscape of small buildings that were the conference rooms and the support spaces. They would then create a bit of differentiation between the space, but mainly they wanted connectivity between everyone. They wanted sight lines the full length of the building, and they wanted to be able to move really rapidly. This is our office in LA, and so we work a lot similar. We're 1/10 of that size, so we're 40,000 square feet. We like this kind of high volume warehouse space. We move around a lot, so there was a lot of affinity in that way. The ceiling is perforated with skylights, so there's a lot of natural daylight coming into the space, and it's a very kind of ad hoc, messy environment, which they really relate to as well. We built this big model. It's 40 feet long of the building, and it became kind of the same kind of board game where pieces get moved around the inside, but the main point of it is it's a big warehouse, and nothing that we put on the floor can't be moved so that they can do whatever they want. The issue of anonymity really came to the fore, and because of Mark's and a lot of the management team, the fact that they really love nature, we decided we would bury the building in the landscape. And so you can see pieces of the building coming through, but this is sitting right on the edge of San Francisco Bay. It's a very beautiful natural environment, and so we said, okay, we're gonna plant 600 trees. We're gonna make a 10-acre roof garden on the top of the building, and Mark loved that because this kind of one-on-one walking and talking. The building is a quarter mile long. There's a loop of half a mile that'll take him, half an hour to walk. And so this park on the roof, really suits their concept. So this is where the model's headed, and like I said, we're getting under construction this summer. It's fast track, so moving really quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Our last speaker is William Porter. William Porter is a Leventhal Professor Emeritus at MIT and the principal of Anderson Porter Design. Bill Porter's teaching and research have been in design methods and theory, and on the integrated study of space, organization, and technology in relation to workplace strategy and design. Bill joined the faculty at MIT School of Architecture and Planning in 1967 and was the dean of the school from 1971 to 1981. He is currently a senior advisor to Cornet's. Selected publications include Excellence by Design, Transforming Workplace and Work Practice, published in 1999, and Design Representation, published in 2004. Bill.
Thank you, Alan. Let's see, we have... Well, I'm going to step back and take a perspective, if you like, from the organization's point of view, an organizational perspective. And there's so many forces at work to create the necessity for work that it's distributed geographically and of necessity culturally. Different places have different backgrounds and components, social and infrastructural, if you like, pardon me, and each of these has to be taken into account. The challenges to the organizations, in the one case, let's say to the organization, many organizations feel that in the light of rapid change, they can continue to do the same thing and enter new territory. This is what we call the Red Queen success bias, referring to Alice in Wonderland's Red Queen, who insisted upon doing whatever she did in the very same way every time. The creation of strong brand is an issue which has been raised by several already, but the intense competition, especially these days, I think is something that one simply has to focus on. Personnel to be integrated into a corporate culture, to have their own career develop, need to be thought of, I think, in two different ways. One in terms of their own career development, and the other in terms of whether the organization can attract them to stay. But in any event, it's terribly important that they respond to the emerging workforce, and Edith has laid out some of the generational differences that they have to take into account. Places are varied, as some of your earlier speakers have made clear, first meaning office, second meaning home, and third meaning whatever else. And both real and hybrid spaces are just part of the reality that we cope with. And something which I think is underestimated in the design of workplace is the need to equip the individual in terms of training, in terms of adaptability, and in terms of his or her ability to move into a different situation and continue to do at least part of what they're trying to do. And the nature of work, given its wide distribution, has a variety of different issues which we confront. Some of them are listed there, and I don't have time to explain each one of those. But working across a distance creates enormous issues, as I'm sure you all are thoroughly aware. So here's just one example of one of the pressures facing an organization. How do they respond to the heightened demand for specialized expertise that come from having to make their place in an ever more competitive world? And in some cases, they can handle it themselves. They can offload. They can take very skilled people and redivide what they do such that they offload low-skilled tasks and redefine their own work. They can recruit, hire, and bring on board and train and develop and so on. And they can, of course, outsource. And some combination of those strategies is absolutely necessary if the organization is going to be able to survive in the highly competitive world. One example, I think, which is quite an interesting one, is the British Airways building at Heathrow by Niels Torp, which is really predicated in part on trying to strengthen the onboarding and community building process that British Airways faced with high turnover and a rapidly changing personnel, mobility within the organization, but also turnover from the outside. And here you can see, and there are other buildings that exemplify these ideas, the central atrium, but very much connected and to all of the other parts and conceived of as a kind of Main Street and community building place. The emerging work styles, I think it's true, are probably influenced by which generation people fall into. But frankly, many of the studies indicate that even some of the older generation are acquiring the habits of the young. And so I think that there are emerging work styles that cut across these different generational groups and that really have to be taken into account if the organization wants to attract them and keep them. And then furthermore, as expertise is not something which can be thought of as concentrated within any single organization, expertise, in order to maintain one's professional credentials, if you like, as you all know, you have to belong to professional organizations, you have to get professional accreditation, and that's only the least of it. If you're a specialist in any way, the other peers in your specialization may well not be in your organization. They may be partners, but they may also simply be part of a professional community, which is very strongly your own. So this idea of network refers to the multiple networks within which each individual lives. I cited this building, the Genzyme building, which is here in Cambridge, as an example of a building in which I think they tried to respond by Benish architects, which I think they tried to respond to many of those characteristics of the younger generation, including the emerging work styles, including their preference for a healthful environment full of natural light, lively places to meet, and a lot of intervisibility. It's quite, I think, a successful building. And of course, here, had I had the wit to cite Noel's wonderful work, I would have put it there instead of Allsteel's. But furniture manufacturers are, I think, redefining the nature of place, and I think you had a very nice illustration of that earlier. Obviously, there's Starbucks, there's Regis, which is the organization that allows you to have short-term residence for your working. Sometimes corporations rent spaces, but more often individuals do, and they charge by the person. But what they've done is to create a space in which there can be exchange, and indeed some of Regis's central social spaces serve as social spaces for the larger community within which they happen to sit. And then there's also the co-working environment where people who are starting up or want to associate with others can go and for very low rental take up residence, but work in an environment in which others are striving to make their progress. And then there are these hybrid spaces, which this is HP, Hewlett-Packard's Halo system, which is quite amazing. Those people on the far wall are not there. They're someplace else. One of my former PhD students, Paul Keel, developed something called the e-wall, which you can see there. But that and variations of that allow people to work in remote locations. And in fact, it was designed for one of the early applications was the military, where people from all over the world were having to make very urgent decisions about action that would take place in a particular place. But the team that made that decision might have been distributed all over the globe. And then some more extraordinary ideas which mix virtual and real in a way which it makes it almost impossible to figure out where you are. But as I mentioned earlier, you've got to equip the individual to be able to enter and survive and dominate. No, but at least to survive in the entire landscape of work. You can decide for yourself whether the warrior of 2030 is the right model for the worker of the future. So quickly then, the workplace has to be thought of as culturally and geographically situated. You have individuals, whether they are stationed in those particular places or whether they're mobile. They're working someplace. They have to be acknowledged. The work settings in which they work may be very widely distributed and very different across the world. Within the same community of practice, for instance, those work settings may be in different countries or in different places entirely, but they're working on a common project. And the way in which this relates to the work of the organization, of course, is that and what they create is something which they create in that interstitial space of the work practice community, and that interstitial space is probably best associated with the cloud now, rather than with a single war room where all of the progress can be put on the wall. But where this comes from is, or rather, what these people do, presumably, is from some organization or cooked up within an organization and assigned to each one of these communities so that they can work through it. And the resources, which may be different in Bangkok or in Omaha or in Bulgaria, provide different resources to those settings and to those work practice communities. And so the organization has to supplement, augment, complement what's available in those places. The picture then of the workplace of the future is, I think, usefully conceived of as a network which the organization has to support, and where the network platform, that is that which supports that network, and we won't go into this, but just a mind map of some of the issues that go into network platform planning. So that the network support platform that supports this far-flung workplace community is, first of all, supporting the individual. Secondly, making sure that each setting works and is the local resources are supplemented, complemented with organizational resources that reinforces the work practice communities and that creates the larger infrastructure within which this communication can take place. This certainly marvelous workplace design for first places, if I can characterize them as that, like Genzyme or like the wonderful Facebook project we just heard about, is still an important and tremendously important component of this. But it is not useful anymore for an organization to think about supporting its work by simply by a facilities department. There is heavy staff investment in organization. There are new models of supervision. The Human Resources Division has to be heavily involved in this. Clearly the IT section is terribly important, and there are issues of security and privacy and so on that have to be faced and are very deep and difficult. There is spatial design, but perhaps the freshest face in this picture is the one of having to really think about the individual and equip him or her so that she can actually work effectively in this extraordinary set of different places. So that's...
Thank you, Bill. I would like to invite all the speakers. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. We heard from the CEO, the industrial designer, the historian, the psychologist, the practicing architect, and the work expert. Amazing presentations. Thank you, everyone. Actually, I would like to have two of my colleagues start this, Nashid Nabian and Panayotis Mikalatos, if they have to start the questions. And we'll have and then we'll open it to the audience to have more discussion, basically.
Perhaps one way of starting our roundtable is by posing a series of general questions that would lead to more specific discussion topics as the dialogue unfolds. As such, here are the questions that I would like to put on the table. First, both in the brief of tonight's event and also in the presentations, except for Antoine's presentation with the historical background, workspace is somewhat equated with office space. Why is it that we all think of the service sector as the primary mode of generating added value and hence the primary mode of working? Why not the factory or workshop as the history exemplifies? Second, if we are witnessing a paradigmatic shift in how the workspace is viewed as an architectural space, and if we are contemplating its near future and distant future transformations, we need also to be thinking about the shifting relationships of with the content of work, the technologies that facilitate it, and the social landscape in which we handle this operation, and also how it has an impact on architectural characteristics of the space within which all these operations are accommodated, as witnessed in the new design of Facebook project. So I want to have an example of these shifting relations, which also relates to Facebook, but from a different point of view. On May 18, 2012, during the Facebook's initial public offering, 82 million of its shares were traded in the first 30 seconds on the market. Such a high volume of financial transaction and trading is not contained within the boundaries of the dedicated architectural spaces of the stock exchange, but a majority of it is handled in cyberspace and mostly through heavily automated financial and trading algorithms. The stock exchange as a workplace then is dematerialized, decentralized, and distributed across a global network of millions and millions of users, and both server-side and client-side active algorithms. This is what I mean when I ask about the different viewpoint of our shifting relationship with the content of work, the network distributed space of work, and also the technologies of work. I don't know if, Antoine, you would like to entertain. Just because you're my advisor.
Let me have the time to wake up. I think it's time to open to the floor.
Yeah. Actually, maybe before that, once you heard everybody's presentation, do you have anything to add, or before I open it to the public?
I like your question of the factory, actually. This is the one I would have liked to raise rather, which is why are we so much fascinated by what is, by the end, a pretty small segment of, the working forces all over the world. Facebook is not, it's a totally exceptional and fascinating. I listened to that. I was absolutely fascinated, and Genzim, etc. But the question of the factory is actually quite a good question. And also all these sweat, office sweatshops, in which actually people do not do things trendy. And so what's happening with that? Because there are actually transformation linked to digital culture. So for me, it's by the end of the question.
I have a question for Edith and Benjamin and Andrew. So it seems that there was some agreement in the presentations that technology suggests or demands a place which is flexible, generic, multipotent. On the other hand, I find it very interesting that Edith suggested that as spaces lose their specificity, they lose also their identity. So the identity is becoming eroded. And I wanted to ask Edith if she could elaborate what is at stake when the identity of places is eroded. And also parallel to that, in a smaller scale, in the scale of furniture and equipment, again, if equipment becomes generic and multipotent and again loses its specificity, do we need to think of a new type of ergonomics? So is there a tension between the generic furniture and the ergonomically optimal specific furniture?
I just take a stab at it to start with. I have always been with people who are more in the domain of education, and I have always noticed that when they talk about architecture, it's a disaster. It's a disaster because they always think of spaces that are as flexible as possible and that respond at any moment to the kind of mood that you are in. And I always say, whether it is a space or a boyfriend, it would be a disaster if they would actually constantly accommodate themselves to your current mood. So there is something to be said about a space or actually a person to have a spinal cord of sorts, to actually have a structure of sorts that allows you to actually move around it. And there is reasons why many people love landscapes with little walls in it. There is reasons why it is very important to think, for example, I think now of Herzberger because I know more about learning settings and to have places that are there. Like a podium, it's there, and people organize themselves around it. So that's a sort of very general take on it. Something similar to me happens when these places lose their identity. The complication is that the school has to rethink itself. It cannot be what it was. The library has to rethink itself. I think it has to be much more also a place where you can produce text in all its forms. Film, whatever it is, the museum, the Science and Arts and Human Perception Museum, like the Exploratorium and so on. But it's very difficult for these places not to begin to become these annoying hybrids. And this is the difficulty. For example, in my field, which is more about education and formal and informal learning, you see many museums that try to become like schools because they try to serve actually the needs of teachers and schools, and they begin to change their own ways of offering different kinds of venues for their people by beginning to look like a school, and this is very sad. And you have entire departments that are now called museology, where you train people to become educators in informal settings. And the schools themselves, in a way, you don't understand what's the core identity of a campus, especially at the time where whatever information you need, you can have at the mouse click. And at a time when everybody has to rethink with all the MOOCs, and MOOCs is like this big fad by all the big universities now to do these distance classes, and classes that actually involve thousands of people. The question is, what kind of a business is actually university nowadays? Who would want to pay, I don't even mean to say the huge prices that you pay to come to Harvard or MIT, but who wants to pay for what that makes a difference in the campus between what you can get now online and through the MOOCs and so on? So all this has to be rethought, but there is still a specific function to all these places that tends to get blurred. So.
Thank you.
And it's interesting to see the case of Facebook. I mean, I don't know how you are going to deal in this big souk. I see it like a souk, Marrakesh. You know, how much are you going to let them just move all this stuff around, or if you have some?
Yeah, I don't think that flexibility necessarily means a lack of identity, because I think, well, one thing that Facebook does, they personalize their space. So by keeping it open and by having this culture of openness where people can spray paint on the wall if they feel like it, they bring their own furniture in, it's a very open system. I think that the idea that furniture system might allow flexibility, but if it's the same system for 10 acres, it's going to be oppressive. Mm-hmm. But if it's lots of different furniture that's brought in a very ad hoc basis based on what people want, and then they customize it and do whatever they want with it, then it becomes a very rich environment that's not uniform, it's very uneven, and there's a very strong identity to it.
I think that one of the interesting things that we observed in the Media Lab at MIT, one of its earlier stages, for those of you who know the buildings over there, the first building by IMP included a black box theater, which is about 55-foot cube. And it was appropriated by the research groups after a while, because there weren't enough of these black box events to support the space unused, and it was too much pressure. And what people did there was very much like what Greg was saying. They worked in there, but they were in there on display, so to speak. They created a distinctive look to their own workplace. It was a bit like some variety of theater, I suppose, but each area became very distinctive, and when a work group, say of a single individual or maybe a pair, had a new product, it was up and visible to others. And the kind of, we can talk about the effects on landscape of such a thing, but here was an instance where the identity of that part of the landscape was a function of what the person was actually doing, function of the work. And in a way it invited activities which, had they been by themselves, they would never have engaged in or would not have engaged in the same way. Their need to communicate, their communication not only through verbal but nonverbal means, meant that they were far more expressive as a worker than they would have been in a space that was different from what they found themselves in. So the interaction between, and here's a space that has some identity, if you like, because it is a black box theater, and to some extent that tradition and that atmosphere, I think, pervaded all of those people who were in it. They almost saw themselves as actors in some sense on display. And the black box theater, by the way, conveyed some of the, and I think in a way it's something like what you're doing with the Facebook. The black box theater is a very flat organization, typically. So it seems to me, but back to the question of identity, that the without identity, if it's simply flat and bland, like the sea of cubicles that we have seen in many instances, is not the kind of environment which of itself contributes very much to the thinking and to the activity of the individual. On the other hand, if you're working in, let's say, a rather difficult place, suppose you're forced to work in a small rock garden, which is part of a greenhouse that's been attached to the building because there's no other space for you to work. Well, how you respond to that may in fact lead you in directions that you would never have gone. And it seems to me the issue about identity is one of having enough and of such a character that when people interact with it, something begins to happen between them and the place, and it contributes creatively to their own work world.
I think we're talking about culture, content, and context. So if the context is the building, you have an overall structure that affects you, the contents of the content, but it's very much affected by the culture. We have examples, or have talked about examples, of very flat organizations. But what if you're talking about patent attorneys? I've walked through a lot of those offices and observed them work. All of their communication is from their office, and it might even be to the man or woman next door, but it's all done by email because they're a culture of record keeping, not necessarily a culture of people who get together in large groups and have conversations with each other. So that culture is very much different than what a Facebook is, and their end result and what it is that they need to do, because at the end of the day, if we're talking about these environments, we have to remember our role here is that we're trying to help the bottom line of an organization, their bottom line, aid their shareholders, help them make money, at least in the Western capitalist society. So that might not be good or bad. I think that that's a statement that sort of needs to be made. What's the reason why we're trying to improve this? We're trying to gain greater efficiencies. But I think that architecture and what goes in it and the corporate culture, those three things really have to balance enormously and can, in fact, make for the success or the deterioration of an organization and how they use those things.
Any questions from the public? Yeah.
So I'm really interested in this conversation about, I really need this, but okay, about the identity of spaces, and I'm really glad that you brought up libraries, Edith, because I am a public librarian. I work at the Watertown Library right next door, and I'm the supervisor of technology there, so I'm pretty preoccupied with the idea of the technology of my space too, and so what you're talking about when you talk about these kind of annoying hybrids, these are all places that are service-oriented. And unfortunately, I think the problem is that we, as service-oriented organizations, education, museums, libraries, there's a kind of expectation that we are going to be all things for all people. And so I guess I agree with you that it can be a kind of annoying hybrid. You know, we try to have a co-working space alongside of a children's space, alongside of an educational space, alongside of a technology space. How do you, if your identity is that kind of all-encompassing public, you know, being everything to all people, you know, how do you avoid that annoying hybrid? I guess is my question.
If I may, I had recently to imagine a kind of hybrid for a project of a student center in a new university around Paris, and we went through the solution of the hybrid, but probably the solution is still to have a specific space somewhere. You take a library. It's true that today you have coffee shops in some libraries, etc. But I still think, for example, that a silent reading room is a signature space for, you know, and you can have signature space, and then you can have things which are becoming more generic, because it's true that a Starbucks-like ambience is becoming a kind of, you know, generic demand for a lot of spaces. But for if you have the reading room, you still keep an identity. So I think part is also to define what is, all the stacks for that matter. They're not stacks everywhere. So it's to identify what are the core spaces that still give an identity.
They're in the basement. They're in the basement.
Yeah, but they exist.
It seems like you've been talking generally, of course, about what new types of workspaces should be, but also implicitly you've been describing a new culture of what work is, how people work, and what they think it should be. So, especially in the Facebook case, you were mentioning just that they already had a very strong culture in place, and it was up to the architecture to catch up to that or reflect it. But I'm wondering, what can space do for a working culture that isn't already there in the culture before architecture?
Well, in our practice, we're a service business. We have clients, and the clients have needs, and it's our job to figure out. And I wouldn't say that the Facebook solution is right for any other organization. If we went to work for a different company, we would, start from scratch again at the beginning and try and design the building that was right for that, particular group, library, art museum, whatever it is. So our process is always throw everything away and start at the beginning. I do think that the Facebook building is going to be very, it's going to be very functional for them. It's going to provide, a great space for them to work, lots of daylight, relation to nature, all the things that they told us they wanted. I think we're delivering for them. So I don't think, we're definitely not trying to define what the new workspace is. We did a building for a specific company, and that company had a culture, and I think we answered that. If we were to, we're always comparing to, they're always comparing to Apple, and Apple is a completely different culture. They're building a new building that Norman Foster's designing, very close to Facebook, and it's a very different kind of a building for a very different kind of design aesthetic and a very different kind of work culture. So buildings, I think, really want to become very specific to who the client is.
Hi.
We'll start there and then go ahead.
I'll start with you. Okay. Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a grad student at School of Education here at Harvard, but my undergrad was workplace design, so I'm very interested, and I really appreciated tonight's talk. My question is, because my interest is learning at work, and it seems like all the design component is very much focused on the doing of the work, so it's very efficient in terms of putting the collaboration work together. I'm more curious about the learning side at work, and one thing I realized is that technology and also the push towards collaboration is making the doing part very, very efficient, and workers are now immersed with the environment where you can just do your work. But from the learning perspective, I think it's also important to have a place to step back and do the reflection of what you did at work. And I was wondering if there are any physical design components that you considered to support the reflective activities that employees can do, maybe a little bit step aside, away from the actual projects that's ongoing at office spaces. If you have any thoughts about that.
Are you addressing that to us? Okay. I think the project that we showed talked about questions of a lot more group activity. And the one chair that I showed you started to talk about, when it was higher, started to talk about the opportunity in an open environment to create a level of privacy. As I indicated, there are 11 products, of which you saw 4. We have a series of screens. They're also kinetic. They can be moved in various materials that start to create much more private environments so that you could use the lounge furniture or desks and so on and so forth to create areas that are much more contemplative. I think it goes back to the question of my patent attorneys. The opportunity for people too need that private time, both visually and acoustically. I think the problem is not so much about bringing people together, but after you come together and put all the ideas together, there's a period of execution and thinking about how to problem solve, because not all corporate cultures are based on a group of people expeditiously coming up with a problem. There are occasions where people have to step back and think things through. So there are elements in the remnant line and then in many other areas of how we develop things where we are trying to give people the opportunity to focus. I think that some of the comments that Andrew made, though, start to make that quite difficult, because a lot of the planning that takes place in this building is something that I coin as planning by fire code, meaning to maximize the number of people that you can fit in the square footage allotted, and that's usually determined by the local fire department. And you're given 6 feet of space or 5 feet of space at a long table, and you're looking directly at someone else. How do we create this, which is a very good financial model because you're getting the best amount or the most people in the square footage and the cost associated with it. So how do we start to allocate spaces and create areas within those overall environments that allow people to do those kinds of things? And these are areas that we're spending a lot of time, and we have products that do address that very specifically. I just don't know that we address them tonight, because I agree that they're quite important.
We're almost out of time. We'll take one more question. And
okay, so I was wondering if you can differentiate a little bit more among. We talk a lot about identities, so it's another thing, the identity, like the brand of the company, the identity of the space, and my personal identity. So when it becomes individuality, so how I express myself and I somehow establish my territory within a company. And I think that some of the neutral spaces, or maybe one of the reasons that the Cube was so successful, because there was this need that people had to talk about their own work. So it's like I'm not a mass. I am an individual producing something unique in the Media Lab. So I'm like, it's about, gaining visibility at the personal level. And I wonder how those tensions sometimes are exhibited in the physical space. So in a company as Facebook, do I feel the need to differentiate myself from others? Can I always be this monad that has snacks and is fully served by the system so that I can spend the entire day and night over there? How do I claim my territory? You're smiling, so it means like there is this issue. Is it like we are designing for the employers for sure, but are we also designing for the employees? And where is this tension, if any?
I learned something at Facebook that shocked me, which was that they told me they don't hire people for specific positions. They hire people that they like, that they think have good skills, and then they let those people define what they're going to do. Now, that's an idea that just like completely blew my brains out, because it's the opposite of what I would do. But
it's either paradise or hell.
Well, yeah, maybe, but
depends on your perspective.
It's for one thing, it's a luxury of the fact they're expanding so rapidly, and their capitalization, whatever it is exploding so quickly. They don't care about efficiency. It's not even in their framework. They want people to hang out, come up with great ideas, make great product. And so I think within that, that's an idea that I would never be able to relate to. It's just not. But I think within that, there's a lot of space for individuality, and a lot of space for expressing yourself, and a lot of space for kind of charting your own course. And
A question for you, just by sheer curiosity, how about the security? Are they obsessed in any way by security? Because I suppose there are a lot of confidential stuff going on in these places if people invent, etc. So how is it managed?
They're quite obsessed about security, but once you're in the family, you're in the family. And Mark does a Q&A once a week where everybody in the company is invited into a room. They close the doors, and he answers any question anybody wants to ask. ask in a straight up, straightforward way. But that's completely within the family. Yeah, so they're very, but nobody comes into that unless they're invited and kind of checked out. So they definitely protect their product in a big way.
Okay, thank you everyone, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion. And this will be a continuing investigation here at the GST. Thank you.
Thank you.